continuous days of the festival, but we've never had a panel which celebrates the entire strength, the full strength of the University of Chicago faculty members, faculty poets that have been visiting us for the CANTO Festival, this inaugural edition. And it would be nice to do that. In the light of the fact that this was somewhat hastily assembled, I think we shall call this a string quartet of ideas impromptu. So, ladies and gentlemen, Impromptu, brought to you by the University of Chicago.
Thank you, Avik. You've done so many introductions already that I think that it's now second nature rather than a burden, perhaps. I asked for the panel position, essentially. I said that I'll take the moderating panel, and John laughed at me, and now it's on a tape, so it'll ever be remembered. But the reason I did that is because I wanted a chance to do it on record, to thank Chiku, John, and Alison for coming, without whom there would also be no festival. I would have died trying to do every panel. And Avik would have then, after I died, killed me, because there would have been no canto. So thank you very much for both coming and for courageously shouldering a great deal of things, especially John, who took over when I was sick in Delhi. I really appreciate it. So one of the things that has, I think, been very interesting and I think quite cool that we've been able to do during Canto is that we've also been able to send Chiku, John, and Alison as emissaries into universities while we've been here in India, and make really fascinating and interesting connections. In fact, as I was arranging them, I felt quite jealous that you got to go and be with students who were so eager to get, sort of contact with the outside, with U.S. universities, and more importantly, with themselves and their own writing through the eyes of another and an outsider. So I was hoping to get a few impressions of these visits and then take the conversation from there. We had Impromptu called this panel Impressions. Impromptu, improviso, impressions of our panels, or of our conference so far, and especially of the visits to the universities. So if you could say what university you visited and what your experience was, I think can take it from there, if that's okay.
So I visited Miranda House, which is a women's college in Delhi. Eventually, after I got there, the two drivers took me to the wrong place, but it was a bit of so we started a little bit late, but so I must say I wasn't quite sure what to expect or what was expected of me, more importantly, because I should say that I'm not actually a poet. I'm here as I'm an interloper, but I do teach poetry. So what I did at the Miranda House was it was really a visit in three parts. There was a writing workshop, which I ran with 8 students who had submitted pieces of writing beforehand. Actually, there was a selection process, which I didn't realize until I got there. I think a lot of students had submitted pieces of writing, and their professors had selected 8. So there was a writing workshop, and this was followed by a general discussion about creative writing, and then a discussion with both faculty and students around translation and issues of translation, specifically how to translate poetry. So the creative writing workshop was a wonderful experience. The students were extremely engaged. They were eager to share their writing. They were actually writing in different genres. There was a lot of poetry. Often kind of confessional poetry, which makes sense. These are young people who are trying to sort of make sense of their lives, figure out who they are, kind of looking back on some of their experiences as well. But they also were able to talk in very interesting ways about poetry as a way of gaining distance from those experiences as well, a kind of depersonalizing power of poetry. And they were very eager to have feedback on their writing and to have reactions and to share it with each other as well, which is what we did. We didn't have a lot of time for the creative writing workshop. There were had about an hour, maybe a little bit less, with 8 students, which is not enough time to talk about every text in depth. So what I did is picked out some kind of themes or questions. So we talked about pronouns in poetry, because a lot of them were actually doing very interesting things with the dress, with the I and the you, or with the him. So I tried to kind of speak a little bit about every piece of work I'd received, even if I wasn't able to go in depth. We talked about there was some fiction writing, in which case we sort of talked about kind of framing in short stories. There was also some very interesting non-fiction writing. One of the students had submitted an essay about an art exhibit that she had visited, and she was trying to both describe the exhibit, but also draw on some of her critical theory readings. So to talk about some of the problems that she saw with the artwork and its audience. So that was a very that was a really interesting experience. I thought it was the students were really. Again, they were really keen to ask questions as well about what they could do with their writing. And then for the other parts of the discussion, the general discussion, again, I found that the students were incredibly astute when we were talking about translation, for example. They were very attuned to kind of ethical problems with translation. For example, they wanted to know about the problems that arise with translating from minority languages into majority languages and the kinds of appropriation that might be involved. And I thought these were really, they were questions that were a little challenging for me, because I tend to work with kind of French and English and kind of translations between those languages, so I'm not always equipped for thinking about the specific problems that arise perhaps with translation in India. But I thought I was really pleased that the students brought those questions to the table, and that really gave me a lot to think about as well. So it was a wonderful visit. I should clarify that the 8 students were for the creative writing workshops, but were there for the creative writing workshop. But there was a larger group of students that was there for the other events.
It sounds like that might be like a great transition to John's experience at Jadavpur, because from what we're talking this morning, you mentioned how it seems impossible to talk about poetry without talking about translation as well, which is really interesting, because neither Alison or I are poets. You're both poets, so I'm very curious to hear what your impressions were and what the difference you saw were between the students that you normally teach outside of India.
Okay, yes. So I'll start by saying that I'm on the off-ramp to retirement from Chicago, and I recently returned to Cambridge, where I used to live, and I've been shocked to see that almost all the students look as though they are trialing to become McKinsey or senior financial figures, and they're walking around in neatly monogrammed t-shirts displaying their college names. Now, when I got to Jadavpur, I was immediately translated back into my youth as an undergraduate at Cambridge, when all of my friends belonged to Trotskyite groups, when we were marching almost every week, when the whole place was plastered in placards and posters and so on. So I felt at once wonderfully at home in this environment, and far less alienated than I currently do from the much more anxious and vocationally orientated scene in British education. So that's the first thing to say. But also, before I got to Jadavpur, I had a wonderful drive from Rimi Chatterjee, who instructed me during the drive on the history or political history of Bengal, from its links with Tibet early on, right the way through to the present, to the influence of petrochemical capitalism, to the position of transsexuals in India. I had an extraordinary level of instruction before I arrived. And then when I arrived, I was introduced to 5 or 6 members of faculty, and we had an extended discussion about higher education in India currently and about the reforms being brought in and their resistance to some of those reforms and their resistance to grading and so on. These are all very familiar kind of questions for me. So that also made me feel very at home. Now, when it came to the work that I did with the students, I had pre-circulated some poems which were designed to show the work of poets who seem to me to be working at the hinge between two generations in Britain and the UK. A generation which I would call late modernists, who were particularly interested in the way in which language constructs reality, and identitarians, interested in identity politics. And these were all poets who had started out evidently as late modernists, but had made a shift to discussing questions of identity. And I wanted to see whether that resonated with the students at all. And I also provided them with 50 provocative adages, which were a kind of distillation of all the things I have felt about poetry through teaching it at the University of Chicago for the last decade and more. And I had hoped that they would rebel against some of these, and I'm glad to say that they did. I also found the students just astonishingly confident and articulate, and I was particularly struck by the confidence of the female students, perhaps more so than of the men. This was very remarkable. Talking to the students during the coffee break, I discovered one was about to go off to do a DPhil in Oxford on the archives of the Hogarth Press and the links with India in those archives. Another was planning a PhD on the figure of the landlady in fiction in the US and the UK. These seem to me to be wonderful, worthwhile projects, extraordinarily intellectually stimulating. So we had a broad discussion for the first hour and a half, and I had to kind of call to order and say, okay, enough. I need a cup of tea at a certain point, because people just after a while they just took it away themselves. Then we moved to discuss their poems, which I had circulated anonymously in advance through the group. They'd submitted poems to me, and they'd had a lot of fun trying to decide which of them had written which poem. Rather like Alison's experience, many of these were concerned, obviously, with identity questions. I think that the only thing which was slightly disconcerting was the one poem which I thought was, I wouldn't say terrible, but the one poem which I severely criticized was the poem which turned out to be the one that had won half a dozen major prizes in India, and whose author, therefore, was a little bit flabbergasted by my negative reaction. And part of it was that it was something which was too sort of self-consciously literary and mannerly, and some of the other poems had moments that were just peculiar and surprising, and I was trying to talk to the students about how they could build on that rather than to try to gloss it over and make it look more respectable. Instead, just to run with what was most odd or embarrassing or problematic about their poems and use that as a way to move forward. So, I mean, afterwards, I went with a couple of faculty to a literary cafe and had further instruction in the history of Bengal and the politics of Bengal. And I just felt that I came away from that having learned a great deal, and that it was probably as much fun as I have had in a classroom in the last decade. Yeah.
That's wonderful. I think that this is, I'm glad that we're having a conversation about this dimension of the Canto Festival, Avik, because it's something that wasn't an original plan for the outward-facing element of what we're doing here. But I think it is, these visits to Indian universities have been some of the most educational for us as faculty on this visit. And I'd love to actually hear more about Miranda House and how it struck you as an, institutionally, and how it seemed different to you from what happens in the States, and how Miranda House is different from Jadavpur and from Presidency University, which I visited today. My visit was briefer because it happened on a Sunday morning, and the campus was completely closed down. Students had to kind of take time out of their weekend to come and attend my event. But I was really pleased to see how many actually did make the trip. About 40 students came in for this weekend event. And I think that testifies, to the kind of just dynamic literary culture that we're seeing among young people in India. I felt like that was a glimpse. We've been seeing, the present tense of contemporary Indian poetry at CANTO over the last 4 days, but I think at the visits to campus we saw the future of Indian literature, and it looks like it's going to be an exciting one. I didn't do a creative writing workshop on my visit. Presidency does offer creative writing courses, but they're kind of few and far between, and the most recent one offered at Presidency was primarily a fiction writing workshop. And I don't know if that marks a difference between Presidency and the other institutions that we visited. Presidency being probably the oldest university in South Asia, and kind of model for other institutions in Bangalore and elsewhere. I think probably even beyond the borders, India's borders in South Asia. But the conversation we did have was about literature, not about the students' own writing. I pre-circulated some packets of poetry from the British and American modern traditions based on the students' own suggestions of what they'd like to talk about. Maybe I should take a step back and say that my hosts for this visit were actually not literature faculty. They were sociologists, which I thought was quite at first I was apprehensive. I thought, well, why didn't anyone in the English department want to be part of this? But it was actually incredibly rich and enlivening to have sociological and kind of social sciences perspective on the questions that we were discussing. The students generated a page-long list of topics on really kind of everything under the sun, but the one that I chose to talk about was experiments in poetic form. And I shared with them a passage from T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland on the assumption that that would be a text that they were all familiar with. And in fact, they were more familiar with it than many of our undergraduates at the University of Chicago. And I took a passage from the central section of The Wasteland called The Fire Sermon that looks like one of the most fragmented pieces of literary language that many undergraduates encounter during their studies, but that also contains a kind of a classical sonnet kind of hidden formally within the text. So we began by asking students to see if they could find any patterns in the text, and I of course was leading the discussion with questions where I wanted them to find this hidden sonnet, but they ended up finding all kinds of fascinating patterns of refrains and prosodic patterns and image patterns. And so when I finally turned the super tanker around in the direction I wanted it to go in, we had gotten to a point where I was starting to see form in a very different way than I had when I planned this little exercise. The other thing that I found extraordinary about the encounter with the students was every American university I've taught at, whenever I talk to a group of students and I ask them to read poetry aloud, it's kind of like asking them to jump out the window or something. Nobody volunteers to read poetry aloud first in a class, especially where students haven't been together in the classroom before. But here it was like, I felt like I was in a theater and performance studies program. Everyone wanted to read the poetry aloud. We read a passage from Shakespeare, and I had to turn down students from playing certain roles, and we read Shakespeare because there's a sonnet embedded in the middle of a famous scene in Romeo and Juliet where Romeo and Juliet first kiss, and then we read some modern American poetry by John Ashbery, that had some interesting formal features too. But what was most kind of invigorating about that conversation was the way that the students kept returning the discussion. They were very sophisticated and had read post-structuralist literary theory and wanted to talk about theoretical and critical approaches to literature in relation to American Anglophone poetry. But they also kept bringing the conversation back to really fundamental questions of, is it possible to say something new in language, right? Are there new forms of content, or are there only new forms of expression, right? And the conversation kept opening up when the faculty, who are in sociology, started to think about the ways that forms and resurfacing and recycled and repurposed forms actually were animating the text that they studied over kind of long periods of intellectual history. So it was, I think, like John, one of the most lively and engaged and rewarding kind of teaching experience I've had in quite a long time, and that was just this morning. And to see this happen within the space of Presidency, which I'd heard a great deal about as the elite institution that produced Nobel laureates like Amartya Sen and so many major figures of Indian society, to walk in and see that it also had that kind of like punk rock kind of feel of being graffitied from like the floor to the ceiling everywhere I walked, with political slogans and homages to everything from Francis Ford Coppola to Marxist political slogans, was quite amazing, just to see how dynamic of a space it was. So that's, I think, been maybe the conversation that I'll remember the most from these past 4 days, was a conversation with the young people here.
I was envious when I was setting these up, and I am more so now, especially because I can no longer do it, and I've been here, which has also been a great privilege, and I'm hoping to start jumping in. I know you mentioned that you'd like to hear Alison's impressions on the students. I'd also like to shift a little bit more toward what I think we're going to take, like what we've learned from it, something that I feel more capable to speaking toward, rather than because I just simply did not have these experiences, which they sound amazing. I also have had a great time here, but I did not get to see these institutions and have the punk rock experience.
Miranda House was maybe less of a punk rock experience, but there wasn't graffiti. It's a very beautiful campus. So with gardens and courtyards and it was very quiet. I think I was there during exam week or something, so there weren't many students around, I suppose, and I only spoke to students from the English department. I actually regret a little bit that I didn't have enough informal time just chatting with the students, so I didn't get a sense, as I suppose John did, of what they were planning to go on to do. I just got to engage with them, during the kind of more formal event itself. I did get to talk to the faculty quite a bit, and including with junior faculty and postdocs at the university, and that was really, really interesting. They had really fascinating projects. Like one person who was who I think was just finishing her PhD, who was writing on prison writing, sort of in India, but sort of also in an international context, and talked a little bit about some of the challenges of getting support for this kind of work, because it's a little bit kind of political, what she's doing, and so she was very interested in kind of making contacts with Chicago, with U.S. institutions, and trying to see what was possible there. So I had more of a chance to talk to some of the PhD students and junior faculty informally. But yes, it's a beautiful place, and that's also when I had one of the best meals as well. They gave me a great lunch, I should say.
Yeah. And it was, I think, one interesting thing about seeing these different institutions, and we'll be talking about these different institutions, when we go back to Chicago, is it's not to romanticize, higher education in India. This higher education in India is in crisis. Just as higher education in the U.S. is in crisis. It's a different kind of crisis, and in some ways, the what we can learn the most is what kind of crisis or crises are occurring here, and that's tempered by the energy and the excitement that the students bring to the study of literature. But of course, we saw the best of the best, right? We didn't see a core sample of what secondary and post-secondary education is like in India today. We can learn from you today, right? What kinds of challenges new generations are facing.
And of course, there are some similarities between the challenges faced by higher education in the States, particularly in a state like Florida, and experienced here, and the chilling effect of some sense of restriction on what can be readily and openly discussed. And students and faculty were very much conscious of that and talked about it.
And funding,
Yes.
and what is the future of the humanities in India, right? One institution we have a relationship with through the Delhi Center and the university is Ashoka University, a new model of liberal arts university, private liberal arts university in India that's beginning to appear in other areas, Hyderabad and elsewhere, right? Is that the future of, kind of new India, the education in the new India, or is it just one part of this complex ecology that includes women's colleges, large public universities, and so on?
There certainly was a worry that humanities teaching would gradually retreat into the private universities, while the major universities would become more and more corporate. Yeah.
I'm going to switch gears just a little bit because I can't speak to this. Again, I wasn't there. But I was struck this morning, there was a young woman sitting in the back, whom we didn't recognize, and there was a panel happening. And I think it might have been you, John, who reached out to her going okay, this is not an individual who has been associated with us. And she had just read the newspaper and come directly here. When we talk about crisis in the humanities, there are, especially because we're in the inside of that, we have such a vast, complex understanding of where the funding is coming from, how we're acquiring funding, what are the numbers of our enrollment. And I only have a superficial understanding of the crisis that's happening in India. But when I see someone like her showing up of her own accord, she's taking classes, she's writing her own blog, and she just came because she loved literature and she just wanted to be immersed in it. She said, I have an understanding that the way that you get better at writing is by being immersed in it, and I want to hear writers talk about writing. So in the same way that when I go back to the States and I go, this feels a little bit hopeless today, but then I go to a public reading and I see students graffitiing their buildings in their own particular way, in their own metaphorical way. The reason I translate poetry is because it is indomitable and it occurs without the funding and the infrastructure. And I don't think I'll walk away from India thinking that there will be a crisis of poetry, though there may be a crisis of education.
I think that's a very good point, and I've been taken to 2 literary cafes, which have given me the sense that, you know, literary work is going on outside the purlieus of the campus. And in the States, sometimes you do get the sense that, you know, creative work has been nicely segregated into the campus so as not to frighten the horses out on the prairies, you know.
Across the midway.
Yeah, I mean, I think the fact that so when I began my session today, I asked the students, are any of you writing poetry or taking classes where you're writing poetry? And everybody smiled, but nobody raised their hand. And then by the end of the session, it became very clear to me that all of them were writing poetry, but none of them were doing it in classrooms. That didn't mean that their questions about poetry weren't urgent and profound and fascinating, but that that poetry for them was not a homework assignment that they would, you know, expect to get university credit for. They were doing it because it was something that was like an intense need for them.
I think one of the students in my workshop had written her piece for a creative writing class, but the others had not. So yeah, I think that.
Just returning to your original question around translation, yes, it's true that conversations devolved quite quickly into talking about translation in the broader sense. In other words, to read something is to interpret it, to encounter resistance is to translate it in a sense. But what was most revelatory to me was when students started talking about how anguished they sometimes felt about the schism between their sensibility in 2 or 3 different languages and their difficulty in trying to bridge those and to carry over something from one language to another. I was expecting something, you know, which was more evidently celebratory, partly because the tendency of this conference has been to celebrate translation, but it was evident that it was something which was psychologically quite difficult for a number of the students to negotiate. And, you know, naively I thought, oh, well, maybe this is something about the colonial inheritance of English and so on. And so I was corrected immediately. A student said, oh, no, English is an Indian language. So that put me in my place, you know.
I'm really interested in like hearing Alison's thoughts on this. Because, you know, as a translator, this will not be a surprise, but I've never made much money writing, period. I write in genres that do not make any money. But if I were to rank the genres that have made me the least amount of money, translation would beat every one of them by a mile. And I think this is true for almost every translator in the United States. And you know, you get paid by the cent and you negotiate by like now fractions of a cent per word.
Yes.
Which means, and I think this is true for every translator I've known, you end up translating because you love something. I think that there isn't a more sincere act of love than to read something and to want people to be able to read it who were not able to read it before. And I think anguish is the only appropriate response, the only appropriate like attitude to have approaching translation, because translation is at its core a negotiation of loss. So you have to just, instead of picking what you will save, you have to negotiate what am I willing to lose in this? And obviously, in the friction of loss, more is created, right? So meaning is created where there wasn't, and whatever, like there are certain things that cannot be understood, and without, you know, delving too far into like translation theory, anguish means that you want to hold on to everything, which makes, you know, very good translators oftentimes, because you get to figure out places where, you know, creation and that friction and those sparks can be maintained and even, I think, nourished, rather than, you know, an indifferent translator will always be a bad translator. we'll be like, okay, that's gone. That can't be done. Nothing else can be done. But, you know, with particularly like really gendered languages, it's one of the places where I see a lot of really creative translation, because how can you sort of insinuate gender into a language like English, which is gendered but far, far less gendered than some other languages, but where culturally speaking, gender is no less important and influential in the way that we perceive the world and interact with every object in it.
Yes, it often takes bravery, right, to translate, to let certain things go, and to you know, to make choices that so you're just always constantly faced with choices. You have to find a different strategy almost for every text as well.
To embrace your anguish.
Yes, to embrace the anguish. It's interesting. But I was also struck by some of the very different discourses we've heard on translation throughout the festival. I think I'm so from translators who are very focused on remaining as faithful as possible to the text, to people like I'm thinking of my conversation with Mani Rao now, who talked about trying to bring the Sanskrit text to the 21st century reader, which requires a certain type of it's not, I don't want to say infidelity, because I don't think that's the right way to think about it, but it requires a certain type of kind of transformation of the text, and some kind of irreverence as well. When she's translating the Gita, for example, she talked about how previous translations had been too reverent almost, and didn't capture the rhythm, the momentum of the text in a way that she was trying to do with her translation, you know, both through using certain colloquial forms, through kind of using the space of the page in a particular way, you know, instead of preserving the form of the original. So I thought that was a really interesting question as well. You know, how do we bring these texts to contemporary readers?
I'm so glad that you broached the question of reverence, because I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Avik, but we've featured four poets that have retranslated great Indian classics, and we've spoken specifically about their latest books being these retranslations, reimaginations, reconceptualizations, and most of them had experimental visions of this. And I think that always leads to a very healthy sort of literary environment where you can, one, the quote-unquote classics have not been forgotten, and two, they have not been revered and kept in a glass box to the detriment of creativity. They are welcomed open texts that are not inaccessible and are inviting continuously reinterpretations of it. I think that was one of those, you know, there have been, because you know, in organizing this festival, I've heard a lot about people's concerns. Well, this is really needed. People aren't reading, or like, this is important, or we need to. But there have been very distinct moments. You know, this was all theoretical for me. I'd never been to India before. And then coming here and seeing things, there have been moments of distinct, like, hopefulness where I'm like, I think I understand the broad scope of the crisis and broad scope of like the concern. At the same time, the fact that this is continuously happening, I think that it will survive. I don't think that it is as dire, perhaps. Students are writing poetry on their free time, and their classics are alive, and they're alive to them because they're continually breathing life into them.
Yeah, so they can be experienced as contemporary texts in a way. Yeah.
And that also is not without complexity and challenges. The kind of ancient Hindu epics are also religious texts in many ways, and so they're kind of contested sites, just like translation of the Ramayana is like contested in the same way that Rama Temple might be a contested site in Indian culture. And so there's a lot of that's an interesting difference between a poetry festival in the US, for example, where you could maybe have someone talk about their new translation of the Iliad, right? And in fact, there is a new translation of the Iliad coming out this summer by a woman, right? Emily Wilson at Penn. And that's a really novel, exciting, you know, literary event. And there is a feminist dimension to, you know, that literary project, but it's a very different kind of complexity and kind of challenge than, say, Karthika Nair is facing in revisiting tales from the Mahabharata as a woman living in Paris, as part of the Indian diaspora and so on. So we saw different Mahabharatas, we saw different Ramayanas here, and one thing I think about the translation dimension of this conversation is it makes me realize, we've just seen kind of the Anglophone surface of the depth and complexity of Indian poetry in much of the conversations we've had. And one thing I think I've come to see every time I visit India and the Delhi Center and have literary conversations here is how much is invisible to us as Anglophone readers because of the richness and the real excitement of the regional languages and poetry that we can't yet perceive.
In a sense, this works in both directions. One thing that has struck me since I've been here is the workings of international prize culture. So, for instance, when talking to some distinguished Indian poets, I found that the poets whom they were citing, the British poets of the 20th century, were poets I had never read because I thought that they were, from the beginning, these were the people who won prizes, therefore they must be shit. That was the basic assumption. And yet I realized after a while, of course, it works the other way. The translated literature which I read almost always, reflects the filtering of international gatekeepers of what is literary prestigious, whereas the poetry probably most of us read in our own countries tends to be a little bit more obscure, to be just emerging, or to be a cult or whatever it might be. Yeah.
In some ways, one thing we can think about, together is what we would love to learn more about, Indian poetry. And one thing that I'd love to learn more about is what kinds of avant-gardes are emerging, not only in Anglophone Indian poetry, but in Malayalam poetry, or Kannada poetry, or there's so much that's invisible to us, right?
I think we're coming to a close on time. I can't believe that there was ever any fear in me that we might not be able to fill the time with all of our impressions. Because the moment you said that, I'm like, I also have a lot of questions. Before coming, I asked Avik, what should I read? Like, what are the important books that I need to read before coming to India? And he went, I'm like, okay, that's just not helpful. But I got this very, very long tome that said 2,000 years of Indian poetry. And I read it front to back and I went, I know nothing. There's scratched no surface whatsoever. It's mostly telling me, there's a region and then there's these depths of books. There are 3 sentences from those depths of books. So it was both invigorating and encouraging, but also deeply frustrating that I didn't have access to all of these books. And I think that it gives me like growing up in Colombia, I bemoan constantly all the lost literatures when the Spaniards came over and they eradicated the languages and they eradicated the texts and the oral tradition. And I am somewhat envious of a country that went through a colony and gained yet another language, but then lose its own and kept its texts. And I think that's really extraordinary. And I shall get yet another volume, perhaps, or 2 or 3 or 20, to see if I can scratch any of that surface. I wonder if there are any questions from the audience. I know everybody has had a lot of panels and we're late in the day, so that's absolutely fine. But given that, I think that unless there are final comments that anybody would want to say, you're holding the mic tentatively. No. So with that, thank you, Chika, thank you, John, thank you, Alison, not just for this panel right now, which I've enjoyed terribly, but also for coming and helping create the first iteration of Canto. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Avik.
Thank you, Lina.